It begins not with life, but with death. The coffin of Henry VIII, one of the most infamous kings in English history, lay sealed beneath the cold floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Buried with pomp in 1547, the mighty king, once feared across Europe, was believed to rest in royal dignity. But centuries later, when his coffin was disturbed, what spilled forth was not grandeur, but horror. Witnesses wrote of the coffin cracking under the weight of the monstrous body inside. They claimed dark fluids leaked from the corpse, seeping into the church floor. The stench was unbearable, described as a stench of corruption. Rumors quickly spread that a stray dog crept into the chapel and licked at the leaking royal remains. An image so grotesque, it became a legend whispered for centuries. But was it simply the decay of a body, or something more? A punishment, perhaps for the sins of a tyrant? To understand why this moment shocked England so deeply, we must look back at the man himself. Henry VIII was not an ordinary king. He was a monarch who devoured life with the same appetite that devoured his body. A ruler whose reign was defined by power, betrayal, lust, and rot. When he died at the age of 55, Henry's body was already a battlefield of disease. His enormous frame, over 28 stone in weight, could barely be contained in his coffin. His flesh, swollen and ulcered, had been rotting long before his burial. Courtiers wrote that even in life, the king carried with him a smell so foul, it was impossible to mask with perfumes and herbs. Imagine being in the royal court, standing before the throne, where candles flickered against golden tapestries, and all you could think of was the stench that rolled from your sovereign. Servants whispered of his leg ulcers, great, festering sores that oozed pus and never healed. They would burst suddenly, soaking his clothes and chairs with foul-smelling fluids. Each day, his attendants dressed his wounds, changing the blood-soaked bandages. It was said that entering the king's chambers was like walking into a tomb before death. Now picture that same diseased body sealed in a coffin of wood and lead. For a while, the stone tomb contained him, but corruption does not stay buried forever. Over time, gases built up inside the coffin, pressure rose, and when disturbed, it cracked. Out came the liquid remnants of a monarch who had once defied the Pope, executed his wives, and torn apart England's faith. His corpse, in death, betrayed him, revealing the decay that had consumed him in life. This was no ordinary leakage. To the people of the 16th and 17th centuries, such an event was a message from God. The rotting of Henry's body was read as divine judgment, a curse on a man who had broken with Rome, dissolved monasteries, and spilled the blood of queens. In their eyes, his coffin was not just a grave, but a symbol, proof that even the greatest king could not escape the rot of sin. But what if this was only the beginning? The disturbed coffin was more than a curiosity. It was a window into the true horror of Henry VII's life and death. It forced historians and commoners alike to confront a haunting truth, that beneath the crown and velvet robes was not majesty, but flesh and blood, bloated and broken. The silence of St. George's Chapel could not hide the soundless scream of a body that had decayed from within, and when the coffin split open, the illusion of royal immortality split with it. And so, the chapter closes with a chilling image: a broken coffin, blackened wood, a stench that filled the sacred chapel, and the whispered tale of a dog drinking from the remains of a king. Whether myth or fact, the story lingered, poisoning the memory of Henry's final rest. But the question remains: how did the mightiest king of England come to such a fate? What horrors in his life led to such horrors in his death? The answers lie not only in the tomb, but in the living body of Henry VIII, a body that was already rotting long before the grave. Before the coffin cracked and spilled its secrets, the horror of Henry VII's decay was already well known to those who served him in life. His body was not simply a king's body, it was a battlefield, swollen, diseased, and endlessly bleeding. To understand the grotesque state of his corpse, we must return to the final years of his reign, when the most powerful monarch in Europe had become a prisoner of his own flesh. In his youth, Henry had been the very image of majesty, tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, and vigorous. He jested, hunted, and dazzled his court with physical strength. Yet by his late 40s, this splendid figure had transformed into something monstrous. His waistline expanded to nearly 55 inches, his frame so massive that it took a team of servants to haul him upstairs or onto horseback. But size alone was not his curse. It was what lay beneath the royal robes that horrified those closest to him. Henry suffered from what his physicians called a foul disease of the leg. In reality, these were ulcers, deep, festering wounds that tore open his flesh and refused to heal. The sores oozed with pus, their stench so overpowering that courtiers gagged in his presence. His chambers reeked of rotting flesh, and even the finest perfumes of the Tudor court could not disguise the odor. Doctors lanced the ulcers daily, squeezing out pus and blood, while servants disposed of blood-soaked rags and bandages. Imagine a throne room filled with golden tapestries, polished armor gleaming by torchlight, and in its center, a king whose very body gave off the stench of death. The pain from his ulcers was unrelenting. Each step was agony. Walking became impossible without assistance, and soon Henry relied on mechanical contraptions, wheeled chairs, and teams of servants to move him. He could no longer ride as he once had, and the glorious image of the warrior king vanished, replaced by a swollen tyrant barely able to stand. The once energetic monarch who had thundered across the jesting fields now spent his days slumped on cushions, his diseased legs hidden under silks and furs. But the physical decay was more than a private misery. It changed the way Henry ruled. His temper, already fierce, became uncontrollable. Pain gnawed at him constantly, and with it came paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty. He lashed out at courtiers, accused allies of treason, and signed death warrants with terrifying ease. The ulcers that ate at his body also ate at his soul. Even his marriages bore the mark of his decay. His fifth wife, the young Catherine Howard, was executed for adultery, but whispers in court suggested that part of her infidelity stemmed from revulsion. The great king, once desirable, was now grotesque. His body was covered in sores, his breath foul, his temper violent. He could no longer fulfill the role of husband or lover as he once had. Catherine's betrayal was not merely treason. It was an escape from a rotting, terrifying man. The physicians of the time had little to offer. They tried poultices of herbs, oils, and even hot irons to drain the ulcers, but nothing worked. Some historians suggest Henry may have suffered from untreated diabetes, others from syphilis or Cushing's syndrome. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a king in perpetual agony, rotting from the legs upward, his own body turning into a prison. And yet, despite the horror of his condition, Henry clung to power with iron will. He continued to appear in public, his massive body draped in furs and gold-threaded robes. But his courtiers knew the truth. Beneath the finery was a body dissolving into decay. Behind the glittering crown was a face bloated and pale, sweating from pain, eyes bloodshot with rage. Every public appearance was carefully staged to conceal his weakness, but the whispers never stopped. "The king is dying," they murmured. "The king is already half dead." The irony was inescapable. Henry, who had defied the Pope, torn England from Rome, and executed anyone who opposed him, could not conquer his own flesh. His greatest enemy was not France, not the Holy Roman Empire, not the Church, but his own body. And so, day after day, night after night, the king lived in torment. The man who had once been the embodiment of majesty was now reduced to a figure of pity and disgust. His court hid their revulsion behind bowed heads and rehearsed words of loyalty. But the truth lingered in every chamber. Their king was rotting while still alive. This is why, when his coffin finally split years later, no one was truly surprised. The decay had begun long before death. His corpse was only a continuation of the corruption that had already consumed him in life. And yet, this was not the end of Henry's horrors. For beyond the ulcers and the swelling, there were whispers of something darker still. the secret feasts, the revolting habits, and the twisted private life of the king that made his court recoil in silence. The rot of Henry's body was only part of the story. The rot of his soul would prove far worse. If Henry VIII's body was already a battlefield of disease, his table was the weapon that slowly destroyed him. For in Tudor England, kings did not simply eat to live, they lived to eat. And Henry, the most gluttonous monarch of his age, transformed feasting into an act of power, indulgence, and ultimately, self-destruction. From the moment he awoke, food dominated his day. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court were among the largest in Europe, employing over 200 cooks, bakers, and servants. The air was thick with the smoke of roasting meats, the clang of pots, and the hiss of boiling cauldrons. Entire oxen turned on spits. Swans, peacocks, and deer roasted until their skins blistered. Tables buckled under the weight of pies stuffed with songbirds, pastries dripping with lard, and platters of fish dressed in sauces so thick with spices they overwhelmed the senses. For Henry, gluttony was not only appetite, it was performance. Banquets were displays of royal supremacy, where excess itself became a symbol of might. Guests watched in awe as he tore into legs of venison, his fingers greasy, his beard stained with wine. Courtiers applauded his appetite, as though it were proof of strength. But behind the golden chalices and jeweled goblets, something sinister lingered. The king's meals were not just enormous, they were unhealthy beyond measure. Rich meats, heavy breads, and oceans of ale and wine replaced any trace of vegetables or fresh fruit. This endless indulgence clogged his body, feeding the ulcers, bloating his stomach, and quickening the disease that already gnawed at him. Physicians urged moderation, but Henry laughed at their warnings. Restraint, after all, was for lesser men. His appetite extended to spectacle as well. Chroniclers describe banquets where entire sugar castles were crafted, edible palaces decorated with gold leaf, demolished by Henry's greedy hands. Birds were baked into pies so that when cut open, they fluttered into the air. A theatrical display of abundance, shocking and delightful for the watching court. Such spectacles blurred the line between food and cruelty, entertainment and excess. For Henry, nothing was too grotesque, nothing too absurd. His banquets were theaters of indulgence, where hunger was not satisfied but paraded as power. But the feasting came with a price. As his body swelled, so did his misery. After meals, he was often racked with indigestion, gasping for breath as his stomach pressed against his lungs. His weight climbed, his ulcers worsened, and every indulgence became a step closer to his grave. Still, he refused to stop. His hunger was not simply for food, but for control, for dominance, for proof that he could consume more than any man alive. The impact of his gluttony spread beyond his body. Servants carried away mountains of scraps, leftovers enough to feed villages. Some found their way to the poor, but much was wasted, left to rot in heaps behind the kitchens. The irony was brutal. While peasants starved in the countryside, their king devoured mountains of meat in gilded halls, each bite widening the chasm between ruler and ruled. Yet even within the palace walls, the feasts were not always joyous. Courtiers whispered about the king's increasingly grotesque habits. He demanded more food than he could swallow, sometimes gnashing and tearing like a beast, food dribbling down his chin. When pain from his ulcers overwhelmed him mid-meal, servants carried him from the table, his face twisted in agony, his body heaving from excess. Some described the dining hall as a place of dread, where the sight of the king eating was both awe-inspiring and repulsive. There was also the problem of hygiene. The Tudor court knew little of sanitation, and kitchens were breeding grounds for disease. Meat often spoiled, wine soured, and unwashed hands prepared food by torchlight. Rats scurried across the stone floors, their droppings swept aside with casual indifference. To modern eyes, the feasts that seemed so grand were, in truth, feasts of filth. It was not uncommon for guests to fall ill after dining with the king, victims of the very spectacle meant to dazzle them. Still, Henry's appetite grew, insatiable. His servants wheeled in trays piled higher than before. His goblets grew larger, his meats fattier, his pies richer. He demanded the finest delicacies, sugar imported from distant lands, spices worth their weight in gold, consumed in quantities that staggered even his closest companions. And always, the banquets ended the same, with the king bloated, sweating, wheezing, carried away to his chambers to collapse in exhaustion. It is no wonder, then, that when his coffin split years later, it was not only disease that made his corpse burst. It was years of gluttony, rotting from within. His body had been marinated in excess, steeped in grease, wine, and sugar until it collapsed under its own corruption. The feasts of Henry VIII were more than meals, they were mirrors of his soul. They showed a king who could not restrain himself, who equated appetite with authority, and who consumed without end until even his own body rebelled. And yet, the horrors of his table were not the worst of his private habits. For beyond the banquets, beyond the ulcers and gluttony, lay secrets darker still, secrets of intimacy, of obsession, and of grotesque desires whispered in the shadows of the court. The body had begun to rot, the table had begun to rot, but in the next chapter, we uncover how the king's soul, his private life and secret desires, rotted far worse than flesh or feast. If Henry VIII's table revealed his hunger for flesh, his private chamber revealed his hunger for flesh of another kind. Behind the gilded doors of the Tudor court, beneath the prayers and ceremonies, the king's bedchamber became the most dangerous place in England. A place where lust and power merged, where love was a weapon, and desire could cost a queen her head. Henry was a man driven by obsession. To him, women were not simply companions, they were pawns in dynastic games, vessels for sons, trophies to be displayed, or scapegoats to be discarded. 6 wives bore the weight of his passion and paranoia. 6 women, each caught in the storm of his desire, each trapped between the promise of a crown and the shadow of the executioner's axe. The pattern was as grotesque as it was tragic. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, endured years of humiliation as Henry cast her aside when her body failed to give him a surviving son. Anne Boleyn, the fiery mistress who captivated him, was elevated to a throne only to be brought down by whispers of infidelity. When her sharp tongue and independence no longer pleased him, she was accused of treason, adultery, even incest. None of it mattered whether true or false. What mattered was that Henry wanted her gone. And so, with one stroke of the executioner's sword, her head rolled, while the king feasted in another chamber. His bed was a stage of contradictions. He craved women, yet his diseased body repelled them. By his later years, his ulcers festered, his breath stank of decay, and his enormous frame made intimacy difficult, even grotesque. Whispers spread through the court of a king unable to perform, a man whose appetite for women was greater than his ability. These whispers were dangerous, of course, for to suggest that the king was less than virile was to risk death. But the rumors lingered in the shadows, as persistent as the smell of his rotting flesh, and still, Henry's lust demanded victims. Jane Seymour, his third wife, gave him the one thing he desired most, a son. But her reward was death in childbirth, her body broken by the very duty Henry forced upon her. He mourned her, yes, but only as one mourns a precious possession lost too soon. His search for pleasure and heirs continued without pause. Perhaps the most tragic was Catherine Howard, a girl barely out of childhood, forced into the bed of a man old enough to be her grandfather. Court gossip painted her as lively and flirtatious, but beneath the laughter was fear. Imagine the terror of a teenage bride lying beside a king bloated with disease, his ulcers bandaged, his body sweating, his hands demanding. When she sought comfort elsewhere, she was condemned as an adulteress. At just 19, she was dragged to the scaffold, trembling, whispering prayers as the axe fell. Her crime? Failing to love the rotting king as he demanded. Lust in Henry's court was not romance. It was politics dressed in sheets. Behind closed doors, he measured loyalty, tested obedience, and punished betrayal with blood. A smile in the wrong direction, a whispered rumor of infidelity, A single slip could mean imprisonment in the Tower or death at dawn. His chambermaids knew the danger. His queens knew the danger. Everyone who entered his orbit lived in fear of his desire and his rage. But perhaps the darkest truth was how Henry used his lust as a weapon of control. He was not content to possess women. He had to dominate them, to bend them into symbols of his power. When he tired of a queen, he did not quietly dismiss her. He destroyed her, erasing her from history, branding her a sinner, adulteress, or witch. His lust left a trail of corpses, wives, courtiers, rivals, all sacrificed to his insatiable appetite for control. And while Henry's bedchamber reeked of secrecy, the echoes spread through Europe. Other courts watched in shock as queens of England fell like pawns, replaced as casually as one changes garments. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings and emperors, "The English king is unstable, dangerous, ruled by his appetites, not his reason." His lust was not only personal corruption, it was political scandal, staining the very throne of England with blood and shame. By the end of his life, Henry was feared not as a lover, but as a tyrant whose desire brought death. No queen slept soundly beside him. No courtier trusted a smile from his lips. His chamber was a place of whispered prayers and muffled sobs, where passion turned to fear and love was devoured by power. It is little wonder, then, that his death was greeted not only with mourning, but with relief. For when the rotting king finally closed his eyes, so too ended the reign of terror in his chamber. Yet the shadows he cast, of lust, betrayal, and cruelty, would linger over the Tudor dynasty for generations. Still, one question remained: if his body was broken and his soul corrupted, what legacy did Henry truly leave behind? The answer lay not just in his marriages, but in the throne itself, where his heirs would inherit not only his crown but the consequences of his rot. January 1547. The great Lion of England was at last brought low. Henry VIII, once the dazzling prince who had ruled with fire and fury, now lay rotting on his deathbed. His massive body, swollen and diseased, could no longer bear the weight of life. His courtiers moved quietly around him, careful not to provoke his temper in his final hours. Even as death's shadow crept closer, the king still struck fear into those who dared to look upon him. The chamber at Whitehall Palace was heavy with silence, broken only by his ragged breath. His leg ulcers, foul and infected, oozed into bandages that could no longer contain the stench. The man who had once thundered across jousting fields, now gasped like a wounded beast, his once golden hair reduced to thin gray strands plastered with sweat. The priests murmured prayers, urging him to confess his sins, to prepare his soul. But Henry, stubborn, defiant to the very end, refused to admit his guilt. He had broken England from Rome, dissolved monasteries, executed queens, and defied popes. Did he regret it? No. To him, it was not sin, it was destiny. Yet those watching knew the king's flesh was already defeated. His body was a swollen tomb, his skin stretched and mottled, purple with decay. He could not even speak clearly in his last moments, only groan through cracked lips. When the end came, it was not majestic, it was ugly. The conqueror of wives, the terror of Europe, slipped away in silence, leaving behind not glory, but rot. Tradition dictated that a king's body must be treated with reverence. Embalmers prepared his corpse for burial at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where he would lie beside his beloved Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son. The embalming was hasty, rushed by fear of the smell, for already his body was swelling. His coffin was sealed in lead, heavy and secure, and placed on a carriage draped in black velvet. But death had not finished humiliating Henry VIII. On the long journey to Windsor, legend says the coffin began to leak. At Sion Abbey, where the procession paused for the night, something unthinkable happened. The lead cracked. Thick, dark fluid seeped through the seams, dripping onto the church floor. Chroniclers recorded with horror that dogs lapped up the putrid liquid before the horrified priests. Whispers spread the tyrant's body was so foul, so swollen with disease and corruption, that even in death it could not be contained. The prophecy of a preacher came rushing back to memory. The dogs will lick his blood. When the coffin was finally lowered into St. George's Chapel, the damage was done. His courtiers had hoped for a solemn farewell, but the whispers of the leaking coffin followed his burial like a curse. The great king had been exposed, not as a majestic ruler preserved in dignity, but as a rotting carcass, bloated, split, and spilling its corruption onto sacred ground. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. For years, Henry had ruled through fear, tearing down monasteries, dissolving shrines, stripping altars of relics. At Sion Abbey, once a symbol of Catholic devotion, destroyed by Henry's wrath. His leaking coffin seemed like divine justice. The king who had desecrated the church was now desecrated himself. The holy floor drank his corruption, and the legend of the dogs became immortal. Some historians debate the story, dismissing it as Protestant propaganda or Catholic revenge. But whether fact or exaggeration, the tale endured because it captured a truth, that all of England believed Henry's body, like his reign, was rotten to the core. His death was not glorious but grotesque, a fitting end for a man whose appetites had destroyed wives, churches, and his own flesh. For the people of England, the king who had ruled them for nearly 4 decades was gone, yet the memory of his coffin bleeding into sacred stone haunted their imaginations. Was it a warning from God? A final judgment on a man who defied the church and lived in sin? Or was it simply the inevitable consequence of disease and gluttony, magnified by fear and rumor? Whatever the truth, the image of the rotting king remained carved into history. Henry VIII, the monarch whose very corpse rebelled against him. The coffin that blood became the symbol of his legacy. It was whispered in taverns, murmured in chapels, written by chroniclers with shaking hands. Even in death, he could not escape scandal. His flesh betrayed him, just as his lusts and appetites had betrayed his reign. The dogs of Sion Abbey became the eternal witnesses to the fall of a tyrant. And so, the story of Henry VIII closed not with triumph, but with humiliation. His body, once the envy of Europe, ended as a grotesque spectacle. His reign, once glorious, ended in whispers of divine punishment. The coffin that blood was not only the end of a king, it was the revelation of a truth England had long known. Behind the crown, behind the splendor, there had always been rot. But Henry's story does not end in his coffin, for his shadow stretched far beyond his grave, haunting his heirs, shaping the fate of England, and leaving behind a legacy of blood, fear, and broken faith. History has a way of softening the edges of great kings. Monuments are raised, coins are struck, portraits are painted in rich colors to immortalize their power. Yet for Henry VIII, no portrait can fully mask the truth of his decay. His legacy is remembered not only in the glittering courts and royal decrees, but in the grotesque shadow of his final days. The bloated tyrant, the leaking coffin, the dogs lapping at what was left of him, and that shadow stretched long into the reign of those who came after him. The crown passed to his only legitimate son, Edward VI, the sickly boy born of Jane Seymour. Though hailed as the hope of England, Edward inherited not just the throne but the fragility of his father's cursed line. Frail, coughing, and constantly ill, he embodied the cost of Henry's desperate quest for a male heir. Within 6 years of his coronation, Edward was dead, leaving no sons, no heirs, and no stability. Henry had torn England apart for this child, and the boy slipped away like smoke. Then came Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first discarded queen. History would call her Bloody Mary. She tried to drag England back to Rome, burning Protestants alive in her quest to undo her father's Reformation. Her reign was short, violent, and drenched in blood. Henry's decision to sever ties with the Pope had birthed a daughter who ruled with fire. But her flames only deepened England's scars. Finally, Elizabeth I took the throne, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The Queen Henry had executed with his own hand. Elizabeth reigned for decades, and her brilliance turned England into a rising empire. Yet even her greatness carried Henry's shadow. She bore no children, left no heirs, and though her reign was glorious, it ended with the Tudor dynasty extinguished forever. The line Henry VIII had destroyed kingdoms to secure ended in silence. The irony is brutal. Henry had murdered wives, slaughtered friends, and torn apart his kingdom for the promise of a son. Yet the son died young, the dynasty died with Elizabeth, and his bloodline ended in failure. What survived was not his name, but his chaos. His reformation unleashed religious wars that tore England in two. His lusts created broken families and rivers of blood. His tyranny carved fear into the bones of his subjects. And his body, bloated, infected, leaking through his coffin, became the perfect symbol of a reign built on corruption. But Henry VII's story does not live only in England. Across Europe, monarchs and popes whispered of his deeds, both with horror and admiration. He had dared to defy the Vatican, something unthinkable in his age. He had declared himself the head of the church in his realm, setting the stage for centuries of Protestant power. In that sense, his rotting body was not just the end of a man, but the beginning of a new world order. His sins birthed nations, and his appetites shaped empires. Yet the people of England remembered differently. To them, the tales of his coffin at Saint Abbey mattered more than treaties or decrees. They remembered the grotesque stories whispered in the dark side, how the king's body split, how the dogs drank his fluids, how divine judgment had struck him even in death. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, carried a weight of their own, because they gave voice to a truth the people could never say aloud while he lived. That Henry was not a godlike ruler, but a man of flesh, rotting like the rest of them. And that is the true power of the tale. Kings may wear crowns, command armies, and alter the course of nations, but in the end, they are only human. Their flesh decays. Their secrets spill out. Their sins cannot be sealed in lead coffins forever. Henry VIII tried to outwit death with power, with heirs, with monuments, but death had the final word. His dynasty ended, his kingdom was left divided, his body betrayed him, and his coffin became a legend of humiliation, ensuring that no matter how many statues or portraits were made, the image that lingered would not be of a golden-haired prince, but of a swollen tyrant rotting from the inside out. Centuries later, historians still debate the truth of the bleeding coffin. Was it real? Was it rumor, twisted by his enemies? But perhaps the truth no longer matters. What matters is why the story endured. People needed the image of Henry undone, because it gave justice to the countless lives he had ruined. The story of the leaking coffin is not just about his death. It is about his reign, a reign where the surface glittered with power, but underneath, corruption always seeped through. And so, Henry VIII lives on not just in textbooks, but in whispers, in legends, in the haunting shadow of his final humiliation. His story is a warning across time. Power can conquer nations, but it cannot conquer decay. The shadow of his coffin still follows us, a reminder of the price of tyranny, of the rot that spreads when desire becomes hunger and hunger becomes law. His body failed him, his dynasty failed him, but his legend remains, not as a golden king, but as the monarch who could not escape his own corruption. This is the legacy of Henry VIII, a reign that began with promise, ended in blood, and left behind only shadows in history.